Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'll be talking about how I drew against a FIDE master, and the game itself, I didn't play too aggressively and there weren't many tactical shots or anything, but it was just this mindset where I wasn't scared to follow my intuition and consider different moves and go for the most active plans, instead of just trying to be solid and play drawish. So going through the game, it started out as d4, however, I grabbed the center because my opponent didn't place a pawn in the center, so I played e4, and it quickly transposed into some sort of Pirt's defense, where my opponent tries to fianchetto the bishop on the king side. Uh, Later he plays a6 with the idea of trying to play b5 and expand on the queen side. I don't allow that. I don't hesitate to play a4, and after bishop g7, I set up this bishop f4, queen d2 battery to try and get this bishop in the future with bishop h6, trade off the dark squared bishop, so the dark squares around the king side will be weak for some sort of attack in the future, possibly. My opponent castles and I play h4, and h4 itself I don't think is a good move actually in hindsight. I should have probably just played h3 or bishop e2, maybe castle queenside, and then slowly start pushing on the king side. With h4 immediately, the problem is I allow bishop g4, and now I really don't want to allow a trade of light squared bishops really. Like if I played a move like h3 here, this bishop doesn't have any really good squares. It doesn't have f5, it doesn't have g4, and it doesn't have e6 because then I'd play d5. So this bishop is not really that great. But instead, when I played h4, I allowed the bishop to get active, and here I actually don't have h5 as well. Because let's say the bishop doesn't develop to g4 and goes somewhere else, I would have the plans of playing h5, and if knight takes, I would maybe even sack the rook, and if pawn takes, the queen kingside structure is a bit weak and allows moves like bishop d3, where I would target the h7 pawn. So those are some couple ideas I had, but h4 I played early unfortunately, and bishop g4 came, so I just developed bishop e2. And then here my opponent strikes with e5, and at first look I thought he was just blundering a pawn, so I just took, and after he took I trade queens, and then I just grab this pawn. And at the end of all trades, my king can't castle, but it's fine because there's not many pieces left on the board. We're going towards the end game, and the rooks are connected, they're gonna come to the center files, and I thought here I was up a pawn. But then my opponent plays rook fe8, and the idea here is he's basically going to win back the pawn, and he's trying to go into an endgame where he's gonna try to outplay me with more active pieces. So here I took a moment and I didn't panic, and here is another important concept I'd like to introduce to you. It's called basically choosing your candidate moves and then evaluating them differently. And now this may sound obvious, but many people just don't do this. They look the rook came to the open file and they see the bishop is attacked, and they would just look at f4 or just moving the bishop, and they would immediately just play one of those two moves. Here I took a brief moment and I just scanned the board and looked at all possible options, and I considered bishop takes c7, f4, and then bishop takes f6. And after considering all of them, you have to make sure you evaluate at the very end and then compare those end positions and then choose which option you like. Again, this sounds obvious, but you really have to spend time working on puzzles or whatever with candidate moves and choosing which sort of position you'd like to play. So here, first thing I considered was bishop takes f6. Here, once the bishop takes that back, I would play f3. And it does look like I'm holding onto the pawn, but again, you have to keep continuing evaluation, because here black would take, and your pawn structure would be damaged on the queen side, and then he would play f5. And you're not really going to be able to hold on to your pawn unless you play a move like king e3. And after a trade, black can just begin to double up and start putting pressure on this pawn. And yes, you're going to hold on, but there's really no clear way to break through because black is active, and you have to stay protecting this pawn at all times, and your queenside pawn structure is damaged, so you really can't advance them forward or try to create any sort of mess to use your pawn advantage. So this is actually a drawn endgame. So looking back, I decided not to go for bishop f6. Bishop takes c7 again. This seemed a bit too messy because after rook c8, black is getting a lot of active play in my opinion, because the knight, once the knight moves, the bishop is also going to be looking at the c3 square, the rook is looking at the c3 square, and it looks like black is getting a lot of initiative. Not to mention the rook is aligned with your king and also hitting this pawn. So here I realized black is getting too much play, so the bishop takes f6 I evaluated as it would be a draw, and rook c8 I evaluated white can maybe try to get some play, but black is the one who's having fun. So then I look at f4, which is what I end up playing in the game. And the idea with f4 is we do end up trading with this knight takes e4 tactic. And once I take back, the idea is black has f6 and he's going to win back the piece and the pawn. However, it doesn't get as messy as the bishop takes c7 line, where black is getting a lot of play, or as drawish as the rook d4. I wanted a balance somewhere in between where I would also get active play. And I realized after this f6 tactic, I would first take on f6 with the knight, and once he takes back, I would activate my rook, trying to trade some pieces. And here I calculate basically if he takes, then I would take back with the rook, and my rook would be getting active, king would be getting active, going to f3, and then maybe in the future I would look at ideas like rook d7, cutting off the black king, attacking the queenside pawns. So that was an idea. And if he doesn't trade and he plays something like bishop takes, I could trade the rooks here and then play f takes e5, and after something like rook e8, I thought I could get in rook d1, and my rook would also be getting active, my king would be getting active. So those are some couple ideas I had in mind, just trying to activate my rook. And okay, in the game, black also tries to use the pin to try and activate his rook. And in this position, I decided to play king f3, basically getting out of the pin situation, uncomplicating stuff, and basically still wanting to keep my rooks connected and trying to somehow infiltrate. We trade, and here black, instead of taking the pawn immediately, he goes to attack the c pawn, trying to infiltrate. I simply don't allow him to come through this pawn. The e5 pawn I'll lose anyway in the future, honestly. So I just decided to let it be. Opponent takes it immediately, and then I play rook d7. So when I first played rook ad1, rook ad1, it was basically trying to activate my rook, and I finally get that in this position. The rook comes through, but before I played this, I had to make sure my king wouldn't be hunted down by these two rooks, and I'll just show what happened in the game because that's what I ended up calculating. After rook d7, black does get these checks in, and my king gets a bit iffy. This rook hasn't moved yet, and I am going to be losing this pawn or giving up some initiative. Instead of basically giving up initiative, I decided to lose the pawn. This is where like the fearless mindset I was talking about earlier comes. It's not worrying about losing material, but keeping your pieces active, basically trying to create some sort of play. And after rook takes h4, I go back to g1. So the king made this round trip. It looks like I lost tempo, but really I managed to get both of these rooks activated here. Rook takes c2 is, rook takes c7 is a big threat, because not only am I winning a pawn, but like it also threatens checkmate, and the other rook will be coming through. And if both of the rooks end up on the other rank, on the 7th rank, it's gonna be really hard for black to fight for some sort of advantage, because I would always have checks at least. So he first protects this pawn with rook c4, and then here I play rook f1. And here black is somewhat stuck. This rook is hung on to protecting this pawn, and here the idea is simple. I just want to somehow access the 7th rank, and these are the ideas I saw, basically trying to be active. When I lost the pawn, I saw these ideas, trying to be active and create some sort of counterplay. And after rook e2, I just simply infiltrate onto the 7th rank, and this is very nice for white. And honestly, I would prefer white's position even though I'm down a pawn, because the play is pretty clear. White is active, and at the very least you should be able to keep checking the king for a draw. But white is honestly just fighting for advantage and trying to gobble up all these pawns. Here black tries to create counterplay, really the only option. It's important to mention both of us were down to like 5 minutes ish here, so trying to keep the initiative and trying to make threats is really important when you're low on time, because that's where you can induce the most blunders. And here, even though he was threatening to also infiltrate and check me, I had the tempo because I managed to infiltrate first. I give a check first and then I take, and I made sure even though he takes here, he doesn't have continual checks, and if I get one move, I'm basically going to checkmate him with rook h8. So here he goes back with king g8, and as I mentioned earlier, we were both low on time, and that's why you have to keep making threats to induce blunders, and that's why I made the threat of checkmate in one, and that actually induced a blunder of king g8. Now here, unfortunately, I do miss the winning idea. If you want to find it, pause the video. I highly encourage you. It's a really nice idea. So the idea is basically in the game I played rook h g7 check, but it's actually to check with the other rook, because when you check with the other rook, the king has only one square. This is all forcing, and then you take the pawn, and then again you're threatening checkmate. So here you just basically won a tempo with this check, because here if you just took the pawn immediately, you aren't threatening checkmate because the king is attacking this rook. So what you did have to do here is realize that once you take the pawn, you have no threat. So instead you check with this rook, force the king out, and then you take this pawn, and again it's still checkmate. And you just basically keep doing that. So in this position, black will take your pawn with any rook. I go to h1. There aren't any real checks because the my rook is also on the h file. And if the king moves again, back to g8, trying to stop mate in one. Again, you give the same check and you gobble up the other pawns. And then here you are up 3 against 1 on the queen side. And black's king side pawn really isn't much because your king is right there. These rooks should be able to stop it. And after the king moves back again to stop checkmate, really the only way, you give a check, and now okay, you can give another check, and then you start pushing the queenside pawns, basically converting your advantage and trying to queen. So that was the winning idea. Instead, I unfortunately for some reason missed that, and I checked with the other rook, maybe trying to win this pawn somehow in the future after I take on c7 with some sort of complications. Okay, but I played the wrong idea, and it's drawn here because black takes, and here black is now doing the same thing I did to him, threatening checkmate, and I have to take the pawn, and he gives the check. We trade rooks, and in this position I tried to get my king towards the queen side because that's where the pawns and the action is, and I tried to get to his rook, and black does the same thing. He attacks my rook here, so I move back, but keeping an eye on both pawns, and then the king again starts climbing up and out trying to harass my rook. So I quickly calculate, like, okay, in this position I realized there wasn't really any way to win, and I calculated the pawn ending if the rooks trade would be drawn. So I just quickly offer the rook trade, opponent accepts the rook trade, and then I just bring my king forward, and in this position I just push h5, and it does at first sight look like I'm losing a pawn, but if you've studied your pawn endgames, you should realize the h pawn with the with the a pawn or h pawns, it should be a draw if your king is in the front and just managed to stay in this corner. And if any of you here are confused on how that's possible, just leave a comment below and I'll make a more detailed video on pawn endings and explain how these types of scenarios are draws. So that's it for today's video. Again, it's just about trying to play active, not worrying. Like in the opening, going back again briefly, I wasn't worried about making moves like a4 or trying to play aggressively with bishop f4, queen d2, and some attack with some sort of idea. Play h4. h4 is a bad move in hindsight, but again, it's about the mindset. I wasn't too worried to back myself and play the moves and like the playing style I usually play with. And again, going forward, again, considering candidate options, staying calm, and not opting for a move like bishop takes f6 where, oops, if I go back, not opting for a move like bishop f takes f6, where I would know I would be up a pawn and I could at the very least draw, but instead trying to play on for more with f4 and basically trying to find active ways with rook ad1, and then even allowing myself to lose a pawn but making sure the rooks get active. And as you saw in the game, I did end up getting a winning moment. It's just about finding the tactics. So it is possible to do anything if you keep your basically fearless mindset and just try to make active moves on the board. So that's it for today's video, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye, take care.